Good morning, everyone. And Linda, thank you for that lovely introduction.
Pleasure.
When Linda first asked me to speak at this event many months ago, I must admit I was a little apprehensive at first because although I knew what the reverse mentoring concept was, I've never been involved in a reverse mentoring program. And it wasn't until I did some more research on this topic that I realised that although globally this concept has been around for about 30 years, in Australia there's only been probably a handful of organisations or firms that have piloted programs, and in fact many of those have only been in the last couple of years. So I then realised that in most cases, probably everyone here, this may be the first time that you've been invited or involved in such a program as well. And the more research I did, the more excited I became about the possibilities of this program. So I really hope that you are all as curious as I am and excited about the possibilities and what we might see come out of running it in this environment. So what is reverse mentoring? So I think we all know that the traditional mentoring is about a more senior person usually sharing information with a younger person. But as Linda mentioned before, this is all about flipping that on its head. And in reverse mentoring, we are asking the novice to teach the master. Reverse mentoring is becoming more and more important, and particularly in workforces today. In some workplaces, there are up to 5 different generations in one workforce. We have a much wider diversity of people, a lot of people in our workforce from minority groups. And the problem is that, unfortunately, that diversity is not often seen in the executive team or in the boardroom. And so what is happening is that many organisations are falling into this trap of fairly stale thinking and blind spots and implementing policies and practices that are actually alienating these minority groups further. And so the whole idea about reverse mentoring for many organisations is not just bridging the digital gap, but it's actually bridging the knowledge gap and allowing people in these organisations, particularly at senior levels, to understand different perspectives. So from my research, there are a number of very large organisations that have run very successful programs, both here and overseas. And some of the key benefits that they're getting from these programs, obviously it's about building a learning culture between the executive team and the employees. So in many cases, it's closing some of those generational gaps, particularly around technology. It's sharing different perspectives and also supporting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Building digital skills, obviously our young people are digital natives. They've had phones and computers in their hands since a very young age. So they have a lot to teach us regarding technology. It's about creating efficiencies through technology in the workplace. And there's also a lot of evidence about how this can develop our mentor in terms of our younger people's leadership skills. And so for many people who are invited to be mentors in these programs, it may be the first time that they've had the opportunity to teach someone older than them or someone with a lot more experience than them. So there are many benefits to be had from running such a program. So I'm going to share with you today some of the case studies and some of the results from those reverse mentoring programs. So it was actually Jack Welch, who is the former CEO of General Electric. And so he's actually credited with inventing this concept. And this was back in the 1990s. Jack realised that his graduates at General Electric actually knew far more about technology and about the internet than his executive team. And so he paired 500 executives with new staff in his companies all around all their offices to teach them a thing or two about technology and using the internet more efficiently. Another great program was run by the CEO of Estee Lauder. And he got to a point where he realised that the future could no longer be dictated by the past. And so he implemented this reverse mentoring program to see the perspective of younger people in the organisation. And there were 2 really interesting results from this program. The first one was that the millennials were able to convince the executive team that they should use social media influencers in their marketing strategy. And this was a first actually for many companies. And so that became a really big part of their marketing strategy going forward. The second thing is that the millennials came up with an idea to have a knowledge portal. And so on that knowledge portal, which they called Dream Space, they shared information or case studies and stories of trends that were affecting the industry. And the CEO thought this was such a great idea that he actually organised for a fortnightly newsletter to go out to all staff, including the executive team, which was sharing some of these discussions on this knowledge portal that was being run by the millennials. Another example is from BNY Mellon Pershing, which is perhaps not as well known in Australia, but it's one of the subsidiaries of the Bank of New York, and it's a very large investment firm. The CEO of one of their divisions, he realised that he had a real problem. And the main problem was that the millennials weren't as attracted as they had been in the past to working in financial services. And the reason for this was many of them were very purpose-led. They wanted to give back and do something that made a difference in the world. And they had this perception that financial services was all about sales. And so the CEO, he implemented a reverse mentoring program, and he paired himself up with a young graduate. Through their conversations, they co-developed this idea of having fireside chat. And so what that meant was that the CEO met with employees on a regular basis to connect with them and to build relationships with the younger people in the organisation. And as a result of that, the first millennial cohort, they had a 96% retention rate, where prior to that, they'd been really dropping off earlier and leaving at a much higher rate than their the senior staff in the organisation. And the other thing that came out of that program was that the CEO asked his millennial mentor to teach him how to use social media. And as a result of that, he became one of the most avid social media users in the organisation. He was posting daily on the internal social media and also became a really big user of LinkedIn. And he was posting regularly on their company page about the activities of the firm. So that enhanced both their retention strategy, but also their internal communication. Another program that was actually run in Australia was with Herbert Smith Freehills, which many of you would know is one of our large national law firms. They ran a pilot in 2018 to try and bridge the technology gap. And that was the real focus of the first pilot round. So one of their young graduates, her name was Myra, she had only been with the firm for about 6 months, and she put her hand up and said she would take one for the team and volunteered to work with one of their the executive director of Australia, which I think is a very brave thing to do. And so she was in charge of running that relationship and trying to teach Andrew a few things about technology. So the first thing that she did was she had him building the web page of the firm using HTML and cascading style sheets. The second thing she did, she took him off to a blockchain session to educate him on blockchain technology. And the third thing she did was she took him to meet a CEO of a startup so he could learn about how to build an innovative workplace culture from the ground up. And that program is still running today very successfully. At Procter & Gamble, the focus of their reverse mentoring was on inclusion and diversity. They paired the senior leaders of the organisation with employees in the organisation who had disabilities. And as a result of this, they uncovered that all the internal videos and communication was actually not accessible by people who were hearing impaired. And so obviously that was easily fixed using captions, and that was implemented straight away, but it wasn't something that the leadership team was aware of until they ran this program. Linklaters, which is also a global law firm, the focus of theirs was around improving the leadership's understanding of minority issues. And so when they ran their program, they invited specifically people from different ethnic minority communities and also from the LGBTQIA+ community, so that the leadership group would have a better understanding of some of the challenges faced by people from these underrepresented groups. and they were able to make changes in the firm accordingly. So look, there's some fantastic examples, I think, of what is possible in these programs. So what can our young mentors bring to the mentees on this program? Well, first of all, the world of work has changed dramatically in the last decade, and our young people have had to adapt accordingly. The world of work's changed through globalization, through digitalization, and also the rise of the gig economy, which means that people may not just work in one job, they may have multiple jobs, and they may work for multiple people, which means that they have had to develop personal branding skills. They've had to be much more creative about how they find work. You'll hear these days of people having video resumes or having to do video interviews. And these are things that, in the last, have only really become common in the last couple of years. They've also obviously got far greater digital skills than the older generation in general, and they're much more aware of social issues. As a result of the last couple of years, they've also become far more resilient. So I believe that they have a lot to bring to this program. So how can our mentees get the most out of this program? Well, first of all, I encourage you all to put your ego and your years of experience aside, open your ears and really listen to what our mentors have to say, both today on the panels, but also in future interactions with them. And remember that feedback is a gift. Think about some questions that you would like answered by these young people. We have such clever minds in this cohort and they have so much to share. So think about technologies that you would like to know more about, different apps that you've heard of that you don't know how to use, different social media platforms and how and why they use them. Also think about different social issues that you may not be familiar with. The use of pronouns, for example, or racial or environmental issues. So these are some of the things that our young people are very knowledgeable about, and they're here today to share some of their thoughts and their perspectives on that. And now I have the absolute privilege of interviewing Claudia Kevin. As Linda mentioned, Claudia is a policy officer at the National Indigenous Australians Agency up in Canberra. And she is joining us today to share her perspective on how young people think and what they have to offer. Good morning, Claudia.
Hey Leah, how are you going?
I'm very well. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you start, Claudia, by just giving us a little bit of background about your education since leaving school and how you've come to end up where you are and the job that you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of education since leaving school, I think one of the biggest drivers for education was I took a gap year straight out of high school. So after graduating, I worked a whole heap of jobs to save up money and then travelled overseas by myself for 6 months. And the reason that I mentioned that is because when I came back, I think it really gave me the skills and the confidence to move interstate for uni. So I relocated and attended the Australian National University. My undergraduate degree was a Bachelor of Arts with a double major in Gender Studies and Human Rights. And then I was also in what's called a vertical double degree. So concurrent to finishing your final year of your Bachelor, you start studying your Master's degree. So I also studied a Master's of International Affairs. And then it's been a bit of an interesting path to get to where I am now. But while studying at uni, I eventually moved into doing some social policy work at the ANU. And then from saying that I was never going to be a public servant, I eventually moved into the APS, working as an executive assistant in the Office for Women. So kind of a less traditional pathway. I didn't go in as a grad or anything like that. And then I've since moved across to the National Indigenous Australians Agency, working as a policy officer. So I'm currently working in international Indigenous policy.
And tell us what energises you most about the work that you're doing currently.
Oh my God, it's just so amazing. I think there are so many things that are wonderful about what I do. I think the fact that I'm part of a team that is influencing the Australian government position to key UN bodies. So things like the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people or the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues is just like kind of mind-blowing to me. And also that we have these really interesting sort of new bilateral relationships that we're starting to pursue. So for example, I'm working quite closely with colleagues in Canada at the moment to develop a bilateral Indigenous relationship, sort of understanding what we can learn from Canada's sort of experience of Indigenous policy making and vice versa. So that's fantastic. But I also just love that like no 2 days are the same, everything's so different. So often we get very urgent briefing requests that are things that on the face of it, you don't really know how you're going to approach. You know, it really needs a lot of strategic thinking and a lot of kind of creative approaches. And I think also one thing that I love about the public service as a whole is that there's this real approach to like one government and whole of government. So you're constantly speaking to colleagues from across the public service about their work and what they're doing and how you can help influence it and what you're doing and how there are like potential synergies in what you're doing. So it's just amazing. And also like, I never thought that I would be here. I mean, I didn't even know that international Indigenous policy making existed. So yeah, I think I am very grateful to be where I am and pinch myself every day that this is what I get to do.
Yeah, and look, you can see in your body language and just how energized you are, which is, I have to say, very refreshing to see. And you're very lucky to have found something that does really light you up like that. I know when we spoke originally, you mentioned that you, perhaps quite a number of people were trying to perhaps turn you away from studying arts after leaving school. What would you say are some of the lessons that you've learned along the way since you left school to get where you are today?
Yeah, I think that really touches on one of the biggest lessons, which is that you really have to trust yourself in knowing who you are and what you want to do, because there will be so many people along the way who will tell you that, you know, it's not a legitimate choice to study a Bachelor of Arts, or there's no clear set career pathway. Like, I swear to God, the amount of times people are like, but what job are you even going to get with a Bachelor of Arts? was like so frustrating. But I think that that's one of the big things, that like you're the only person who knows yourself and what you're good at and what you're passionate about. And if you fall into the trap of studying something that you don't want to study, you're setting yourself up to constantly try to meet other people's expectations. And at the end of the day, it's your life, you know, and you can always change later on and you can always move around. But I think starting out very clearly with some kind of idea of like what drives you is really important, and always sort of returning to that as your career progresses. I think as well, like you just have to back yourself. Like if you don't back yourself, you're giving other people permission to not back you either. So I think you have to find the things that drive your own confidence, and really like use those to center yourself a lot. And also just keep an open mind. Like never say never. Like I never thought I'd be in the public service. I never thought that this would be where I'd end up. So keeping an open mind and just embracing like a non-traditional pathway, I think are really, really important lessons that are applicable at any stage of your life or your career, no matter what you're doing. Yeah.
Very good advice, Claudia. I know you have a very curious mind. What or who is inspiring you right now?
Oh, I just think there are so many inspiring people right now. I think that especially in this time during the pandemic, when so many people are experiencing such significant hardship, there are so many sources of inspiration everywhere. And I think kind of in keeping with the theme for this morning, like people my age and people younger than me, like there are so many like massive challenges that people that are coming out of high school are facing and that they're inheriting. And yet there are so many wonderful, inspiring people who are creating startups and throwing themselves into creating multiple different businesses at once. And I think those people who are just throwing themselves at life with like this massive problem solving attitude and just huge bucket loads of resilience, I think is just so inspiring. And I think that personally, I find that really wonderful to see and really wonderful to watch.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think sometimes these difficult times bring out the best of us and bring out some creativity, don't they?
Yeah, totally.
What unique skills and experience do you feel that the young people and different perspectives do you think the young people can bring to this particular program?
Oh, there are so many things. I think you touched on some of them before. Like, I think the whole point of young people being digital natives is really important to touch on. I think that young people across the board have this fantastic understanding of technology, but not just how to use technology, but how it influences people around them, influences their own lives. And I think as a result of that, they have far more enhanced critical thinking skills in terms of processing that information and the ways that they can understand its impact or, where it's come from. I think as well, just this phenomenal willingness to embrace change, but also push for change in situations where people may be resistant to it or organizations may be resistant to it. And I think that comes from, really having a phenomenal source of confidence. Yeah.
Well done. What change would you like to see in the world, Claudia?
Oof. At the risk of sounding a little bit sort of kumbaya, I think that it's just got to be more kindness and more understanding. I think that one of the most important things to remember is that people are people everywhere. Even if people are the heads of very important organizations or departments or whatever versus the entry-level people, or like people who are doing really important support work, like and enabling work like cleaning and things like that. People are people everywhere, and to understand that and to try to get to know who people are and what their aspirations are and what is holding them back or what's a challenge that they're experiencing, I think really helps everyone go a long way. But I also think, the people that have inspired me most in terms of leaders and demonstrating a style of leadership that I want to emulate are those people that are willing to get to know everyone around them, not just the people of perceived importance. And so I think that that's something that is just applicable to everybody. So that's the change I'd like to see in the world.
Yeah, great. And look, I think that's what these programs are all about. It's about the executives and the senior people in these organizations getting to see the perspectives of everyone from the ground up. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today and for joining us from Canberra. Rachel, I'll go back over to you to go into the breakout rooms. Thanks, Claudia.